My father slid the quitclaim deed across the heavy oak dining table. The thick paper made a quiet scraping sound against the wood. It stopped exactly 1 inch from my hands. My fingernails were still stained with the dark Iowa topsoil I had been working since 4 in the morning. Across from me sat my older sister Vanessa. She adjusted her taupe cashmere wrap and breathed shallowly through her mouth, as if the faint smell of fertilizer on my work boots offended her. She had lived in Chicago for a decade and had not set foot in this house since our grandmother passed away. Now she was sipping a glass of expensive Merlot, waiting for me to sign away my life. "Sign the farm over, Abigail," my father said. His voice was flat and clinical, the kind of voice a bank manager uses to deny a loan. "Your sister has investors from the city. She has a real vision for this property. If you make this difficult, you are out of this family. I will have the locks on the main barn changed by tomorrow morning." My mother sat beside him meticulously buttering a dinner roll. She did not even look up at me. "Vanessa is the one who truly deserves a legacy," my mother murmured. "You can always find work in town, Abby." I sat there listening to the grandfather clock tick in the hallway. 15 years. I took over this farm when it was drowning in debt. I built it into a $1.2 million operation with my own 2 hands, while they treated me like a hired farmhand. But I did not cry. I did not beg. I just kept my hand resting on the heavy manila folder hidden in my lap, the one holding the updated land surveys they knew nothing about. Welcome to Sophia Vengeance, where we share the stories of quiet women who survive the loudest family betrayals. If you have ever been the invisible backbone of a family that took you for granted, tell me your age in the comments and subscribe. Because the story of how my sister tried to steal my farm ends with a county surveyor dropping a truth that made everyone at this table go dead silent. I looked back at the single sheet of paper on the table, a quitclaim deed, just a few lines of legal jargon meant to erase a decade and a half of crop rotations and broken tractor axles and sleepless nights checking irrigation lines in the freezing rain. Vanessa leaned forward, resting her manicured elbows on the table. "Come on, Abby," she said, offering a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You look exhausted anyway. Let me take this burden off your hands. My investors want to build a rustic agritourism retreat here. We might even keep one of your old tractors around for aesthetics." My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. A rustic retreat. She wanted to pave over the premium crop fields I had nursed back to health just to build luxury cabins for city executives. I looked at my father. He sat at the head of the table where the overhead light caught the silver in his hair, projecting the image of a proud heartland patriarch. But he was a patriarch of nothing. He had run the original 40 acres into the ground before I was old enough to buy my first truck. He believed he owned everything as far as the eye could see, simply because his name was on the mailbox out front. I picked up my linen napkin. I folded it in half and then in quarters, pressing the creases down hard against the wood. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I stood up, pushing my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floorboards, making my mother flinch. "I will need to review the paperwork," I said, my voice low and steady. "Give me a few days." My father nodded, leaning back in his chair like a king granting a brief pardon to a peasant. "Do not take too long," he warned. "The architects arrive on Thursday." I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving the quitclaim deed sitting next to my cold dinner. Let them bring their architects. They were measuring a kingdom that had already changed hands. I pushed through the heavy oak front door and stepped out onto the wraparound porch. The crisp October wind hit my face, carrying the familiar scent of dry corn stalks and damp earth. I walked down the wooden steps, my work boots crunching rhythmically against the gravel driveway. The night sky over Iowa was vast and indifferent. I stopped near the edge of the front yard and looked back at the farmhouse. It stood tall and stark against the moonlight. We lived just a few miles down the county highway from the actual American Gothic house in Eldon. Growing up, I always felt my parents viewed that famous painting not as a piece of art, but as an instruction manual. They demanded the same stiff posture, the same performative rural pride, the same unsmiling projection of heartland royalty. Richard and Diane Granger loved the aesthetic of farming. They loved standing on the porch in crisp flannel shirts, waving at the neighbors whose trucks rattled down the dirt road. They loved the idea of being landowners. But the reality of dirt is that it does not care about your posture. Dirt only respects sweat. And behind the freshly painted wooden siding of our home, the foundation of my father's legacy had been rotting for a very long time. I walked past the old wooden fence, tracing my fingers along the splintered rails. I remembered the exact day the illusion shattered for me. I was 19 years old. I had my bags packed in the hallway, ready to drive to Ames to study agronomy at the university. I came downstairs to find my father sitting at the kitchen table, holding a stack of letters printed in angry red ink. The bank was threatening foreclosure. My father had spent the better part of a decade buying shiny new machinery on credit to impress the other men at the county cooperative, while ignoring the shifting commodity prices and the degrading nitrogen levels in our soil. The original 40-acre Granger parcel was mortgaged to the hilt. The farm was dying, and my father was too proud to ask for help. I never made it to Ames. I unpacked my bags that afternoon. I put on a pair of leather work gloves, and I stepped into a pair of boots that I would rarely take off for the next 15 years. The first 3 seasons were a brutal calculation of survival. I traded my youth for soil samples and weather reports. I woke up at 4 every morning to check the irrigation lines. I spent my nights sitting at the same kitchen table where my father had nearly lost everything, reading university extension reports until the letters blurred together. I learned to negotiate with seasoned seed representatives who initially asked to speak to the man of the house. I learned how to fix a cracked diesel line on a combine harvester with frozen fingers in the middle of November. I quietly funneled every spare dollar I could squeeze out of the yield into paying off the back taxes my father had buried in his desk drawer. And while I was pulling heavy stones out of the south field until my shoulders burned, Vanessa was packing her designer luggage. She chose a private liberal arts college in Boston. My mother framed it as a necessary family sacrifice for Vanessa to secure a brilliant future in the city. But the family was not making the sacrifice. I was. My blistered hands paid her out-of-state tuition. My endless shifts driving the grain cart funded her study abroad semester in Florence. Every time the farm turned a small profit, my mother would write a check to Vanessa, leaving me to tape my work boots back together with duct tape. I became the invisible engine of the Granger household. I was the over-functioning daughter, expected to keep the machinery running in the dark while the passengers enjoyed the scenic view from the first-class cabin. I watched my father stand tall at the annual agricultural banquets, accepting firm handshakes and hearty congratulations for the bumper crops I alone had cultivated. He soaked up the praise like dry earth soaking up rain, never once mentioning the daughter standing in the back of the room, nursing a sprained wrist. I let him have the applause. I let him maintain his American Gothic facade. I did it because I believed in the sanctity of the soil. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I saved the family name from ruin, my parents would eventually see me. I thought the dirt would earn me their respect. But respect is a currency my parents only spent on my sister. When Vanessa graduated, she did not come back to the farm. She took a corporate job in Chicago and rented an apartment that cost more per month than our annual tractor maintenance budget. She called on holidays, usually complaining about the slow pace of rural life, before asking our mother for another loan. I kept my head down and kept working. By my late 20s, I had transformed the failing 40 acres into a high-yield agricultural enterprise. I brought in precision farming technology. I secured lucrative vendor contracts. I turned the Granger name into a multi-million-dollar operation. My parents walked around the property acting like feudal lords surveying their undisputed estate. They looked at the gleaming new steel grain bins, the GPS-guided tractors, and the sprawling fields of golden corn, and they saw their own reflection. They were blinded by their own arrogance. They assumed that because they birthed me, they owned everything I built. They never bothered to look at the paperwork. They never read the fine print on the vendor contracts. They never asked how I was securing the loans for the new equipment. When I realized the depth of my father's financial incompetence, I knew I could not tie my future to his sinking ship. I stopped putting my harvest money into the joint family accounts. Years ago, I drove to a quiet legal office in Des Moines and formed Granger Agricultural Solutions. It was a meticulously structured limited liability company. I put every new asset, every crop insurance policy, every expanded acre of leased land firmly inside that corporate structure. My father thought the bank was simply restructuring his old debts under my supervision. He hated reading legal documents. He found financial terminology insulting to his old-school sensibilities. So he signed the operational proxies over to me without a second thought. I became the sole managing member of an empire hiding in plain sight. He thought he was the king of the farm, but he was just a man standing on dirt I allowed him to use. I stood there in the cold Iowa night listening to the wind rustle through the dry stalks. The manila folder sitting in my bedroom upstairs contained the real ledgers, the ledgers kept entirely out of my father's sight. The quitclaim deed he had thrown at me during dinner was a worthless piece of paper, designed to steal a company he had no legal right to touch. He wanted to hand my life over to Vanessa so she could play at being a rustic entrepreneur. The heavy wooden screen door of the farmhouse creaked open, breaking the silence of the yard. The yellow porch light spilled out onto the gravel. Vanessa stepped outside holding her wine glass, her taupe wrap pulled tight against the chill. She leaned against the wooden railing, looking out at the dark fields with a predatory gleam in her eye. "It really is beautiful out here at night," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "The architects are going to love this layout, Abigail. We are thinking of putting the main guest lodge right over there, by the old silos. It will block that eyesore of a tractor shed." I looked at the silos. My silos, built with my money, on land secured by my company. I shoved my cold hands into the pockets of my canvas jacket. "You should get some sleep, Vanessa," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Tomorrow is going to be a very long day." I pushed through the heavy oak front door and stepped out onto the wraparound porch. The crisp October wind hit my face, carrying the familiar scent of dry cornstalks and damp earth. I walked down the wooden steps, my work boots crunching rhythmically against the gravel driveway. The night sky over Iowa was vast and indifferent. I stopped near the edge of the front yard and looked back at the farmhouse. It stood tall and stark against the moonlight. We lived just a few miles down the county highway from the actual American Gothic house in Eldon. Growing up, I always felt my parents viewed that famous painting not as a piece of art, but as an instruction manual. They demanded the same stiff posture, the same performative rural pride, the same unsmiling projection of heartland royalty. Richard and Diane Granger loved the aesthetic of farming. They loved standing on the porch in crisp flannel shirts, waving at the neighbors whose trucks rattled down the dirt road. They loved the idea of being landowners. But the reality of dirt is that it does not care about your posture. Dirt only respects sweat. And behind the freshly painted wooden siding of our home, the foundation of my father's legacy had been rotting for a very long time. I walked past the old wooden fence, tracing my fingers along the splintered rails. I remembered the exact day the illusion shattered for me. I was 19 years old. I had my bags packed in the hallway, ready to drive to Ames to study agronomy at the university. I came downstairs to find my father sitting at the kitchen table, holding a stack of letters, printed in angry red ink. The bank was threatening foreclosure. My father had spent the better part of a decade buying shiny new machinery on credit to impress the other men at the county cooperative, while ignoring the shifting commodity prices and the degrading nitrogen levels in our soil. The original 40-acre Granger parcel was mortgaged to the hilt. The farm was dying, and my father was too proud to ask for help. I never made it to Ames. I unpacked my bags that afternoon. I put on a pair of leather work gloves and I stepped into a pair of boots that I would rarely take off for the next 15 years. The first 3 seasons were a brutal calculation of survival. I traded my youth for soil samples and weather reports. I woke up at 4 every morning to check the irrigation lines. I spent my nights sitting at the same kitchen table where my father had nearly lost everything, reading university extension reports until the letters blurred together. I learned to negotiate with seasoned seed representatives who initially asked to speak to the man of the house. I learned how to fix a cracked diesel line on a combine harvester with frozen fingers in the middle of November. I quietly funneled every spare dollar I could squeeze out of the yield into paying off the back taxes my father had buried in his desk drawer. And while I was pulling heavy stones out of the south field until my shoulders burned, Vanessa was packing her designer luggage. She chose a private liberal arts college in Boston. My mother framed it as a necessary family sacrifice for Vanessa to secure a brilliant future in the city. But the family was not making the sacrifice. I was. My blistered hands paid her out-of-state tuition. My endless shifts driving the grain cart funded her study abroad semester in Florence. Every time the farm turned a small profit, my mother would write a check to Vanessa, leaving me to tape my work boots back together with duct tape. I became the invisible engine of the Granger household. I was the over-functioning daughter expected to keep the machinery running in the dark while the passengers enjoyed the scenic view from the first-class cabin. I watched my father stand tall at the annual agricultural banquets, accepting firm handshakes and hearty congratulations for the bumper crops I alone had cultivated. He soaked up the praise like dry earth soaking up rain, never once mentioning the daughter standing in the back of the room nursing a sprained wrist. I let him have the applause. I let him maintain his American Gothic facade. I did it because I believed in the sanctity of the soil. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I saved the family name from ruin, my parents would eventually see me. I thought the dirt would earn me their respect. But respect is a currency my parents only spent on my sister. When Vanessa graduated, she did not come back to the farm. She took a corporate job in Chicago and rented an apartment that cost more per month than our annual tractor maintenance budget. She called on holidays, usually complaining about the slow pace of rural life, before asking our mother for another loan. I kept my head down and kept working. By my late 20s, I had transformed the failing 40 acres into a high-yield agricultural enterprise. I brought in precision farming technology. I secured lucrative vendor contracts. I turned the Granger name into a multi-million-dollar operation. My parents walked around the property, acting like feudal lords surveying their undisputed estate. They looked at the gleaming new steel grain bins, the GPS-guided tractors, and the sprawling fields of golden corn, and they saw their own reflection. They were blinded by their own arrogance. They assumed that because they birthed me, they owned everything I built. They never bothered to look at the paperwork. They never read the fine print on the vendor contracts. They never asked how I was securing the loans for the new equipment. When I realized the depth of my father's financial incompetence, I knew I could not tie my future to his sinking ship. I stopped putting my harvest money into the joint family accounts. Years ago, I drove to a quiet legal office in Des Moines and formed Granger Agricultural Solutions. It was a meticulously structured limited liability company. I put every new asset, every crop insurance policy, every expanded acre of leased land firmly inside that corporate structure. My father thought the bank was simply restructuring his old debts under my supervision. He hated reading legal documents. He found financial terminology insulting to his old-school sensibilities. So he signed the operational proxies over to me without a second thought. I became the sole managing member of an empire hiding in plain sight. He thought he was the king of the farm, but he was just a man standing on dirt I allowed him to use. I stood there in the cold Iowa night, listening to the wind rustle through the dry stalks. The manila folder sitting in my bedroom upstairs contained the real ledgers, the ledgers kept entirely out of my father's sight. The quitclaim deed he had thrown at me during dinner was a worthless piece of paper designed to steal a company he had no legal right to touch. He wanted to hand my life over to Vanessa so she could play at being a rustic entrepreneur. The heavy wooden screen door of the farmhouse creaked open, breaking the silence of the yard. The yellow porch light spilled out onto the gravel. Vanessa stepped outside, holding her wineglass, her taupe wrap pulled tight against the chill. She leaned against the wooden railing, looking out at the dark fields with a predatory gleam in her eye. "It really is beautiful out here at night," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "The architects are going to love this layout, Abigail. We are thinking of putting the main guest lodge right over there, by the old silos. It will block that eyesore of a tractor shed." I looked at the silos, my silos, built with my money, on land secured by my company. I shoved my cold hands into the pockets of my canvas jacket. "You should get some sleep, Vanessa," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Tomorrow is going to be a very long day." I woke up the next morning at 4:15. The farmhouse was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I pulled on my insulated coveralls and laced up my boots, moving through the kitchen in the dark. As I reached for the coffee pot, my hand brushed against something neon yellow stuck to the stainless steel carafe. It was a sticky note. The handwriting was looped and elegant, unmistakably Vanessa. "Please make sure the diesel smell is washed out of your clothes before you come into the main house. Some of us are sensitive to industrial odors." I stared at the little yellow square. The industrial odor she found so offensive was the scent of the fuel that powered the combines harvesting the grain that paid her rent in Chicago. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash. It was only Wednesday. The architects were not due until tomorrow. But Vanessa was already nesting, treating the farmhouse like her new personal showroom, and treating me like an uncooperative maid. I poured my coffee into a travel mug and walked out the back door. The air was biting cold, freezing the dew on the grass into a thin layer of frost. I spent the next 3 hours running diagnostic checks on the newer irrigation pumps out by the eastern ridge. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the harvested stalks, I drove my truck back toward the main yard. As I killed the engine near the equipment shed, I heard voices drifting from the front porch. I stepped out of the truck and walked quietly along the side of the house, pausing near the large oak tree that shielded the porch from view. Vanessa was standing on the top step holding her phone out in front of her on speaker. She was wearing a thick wool cardigan wrapped tight against the chill, tapping her foot impatiently. "Yes, Marcus, I understand the timeline," she was saying, projecting her voice with that forced authority she used when talking to men in suits. "The zoning laws out here are practically non-existent. We can break ground on the luxury cabins by April. The premium fields will be leveled and seeded for the native grass aesthetic you wanted." A man's voice crackled through the phone speaker, metallic and sharp. "And the current tenant? You said there might be some resistance from the farm manager." Vanessa laughed. It was a thin, dismissive sound. "Oh, do not worry about her. My parents are handling the eviction of the hired help as we speak. She is stubborn, but she has no leverage. She will sign the quit claim by Friday and we will have full access. Just keep the investors focused on the agritourism projections." I stood behind the oak tree, gripping the travel mug so tight my knuckles turned white. The hired help. That is what I was to her. Not a sister, not the agriculturalist who built the multi-million-dollar yields she was currently using as collateral for her rustic retreat. I was an obstacle to be cleared away, a nuisance tenant sitting on her prospective gold mine. She wanted to bulldoze the premium crop fields, the very soil I had spent 15 years balancing, testing, and nurturing back to peak fertility. She wanted to tear it all up to plant decorative native grass so wealthy city executives could pretend they were roughing it while sipping artisan lattes. I did not interrupt her call. I did not storm the porch and demand an apology. I simply turned around and walked back to the equipment shed. The resolve that had formed in me the night before crystallized into something cold and unbreakable. Later that afternoon, I was in the machine shop, changing the oil on the John Deere 7R series tractor, when my mother walked in. Diane Granger rarely entered the machine shop. She disliked the smell of grease and the inevitable dust that clung to her slacks. She stood near the doorway, arms crossed, hugging herself against the draft. "Abigail," she called out, her voice tight and impatient. I slid out from under the tractor, wiping my hands on a shop rag. "Yes, Diane." I had stopped calling her mom years ago, though she never seemed to notice the shift. "Vanessa's architects called. They are coming a day early. They will be here this afternoon to take preliminary measurements of the main house." Diane looked around the shop, her nose wrinkling slightly at the clutter of tools and spare parts. "You need to start moving your personal items out of the East Wing bedroom. They need to visualize the space for the master suite renovations." I threw the shop rag onto the workbench. "You want me to pack my room before I have even signed the quitclaim deed?" Diane sighed the long-suffering sigh of a woman dealing with an unruly child. "We are a family, Abby. We do not need pieces of paper to dictate when things move forward. Your sister needs the space to start her measurements. Just put your things in boxes and stack them in the garage for now." She turned and walked out, assuming my compliance. She believed that because I had always done the heavy lifting, I would continue to carry the burden without complaint. I walked out of the shop an hour later and stood by the gravel driveway, watching a sleek silver SUV pull up to the farmhouse. Two men in crisp button-down shirts and designer jeans stepped out carrying laser measuring tools and thick leather portfolios. Vanessa rushed out of the front door to greet them, pointing excitedly at the roofline and the wraparound porch. I watched them set up their tripods and aim their lasers at the corners of the house. They were meticulously calculating the square footage, the angles, the structural load-bearing walls. I leaned against the rusted fender of my old farm truck and felt a genuine smile touch my lips. They were measuring a house that technically sat on land Vanessa would never own. I had known this for 5 years. When I bought the adjacent 300-acre parcel at auction using the profits from my LLC, I paid for a full topographical survey. The old property lines drawn back in the 1980s were a mess. My father, in his eternal cheapness, had never bothered to update the boundaries when he built the new main barns or expanded the farmhouse footprint. The original 10-acre Granger parcel was nothing but a narrow strip of low-lying, swampy ground near the county road. The farmhouse, the new grain silos, the premium irrigation systems, and the vast majority of the fertile crop fields all sat squarely across the boundary line, on my land. I did not say a word to the architects. I let them measure every inch of the porch. Instead, I walked back to my office in the secondary pole barn. I booted up my computer and opened the digital files for Granger Agricultural Solutions. I checked the titles on every piece of heavy machinery, every truck, every storage bin, all registered to the LLC. Then I walked out to the main equipment barn. My father kept the keys to this particular barn on a hook by the back door of the house, treating it like his personal domain. I spent the next 2 hours quietly moving the combine harvester, the 2 largest tractors, and the precision seeders out of his barn and into my secondary pole barn located firmly inside my property lines. I parked the million-dollar equipment in a neat row. I locked the heavy steel doors of the pole barn and pocketed the single key. I was organizing my defense, ensuring that when the storm finally broke, my assets were secured. I walked back toward the house as the sun began to set, casting a fiery orange glow over the fields I owned. The architects were just packing up their laser levels, congratulating Vanessa on the structural integrity of the farmhouse. They had no idea they had spent the afternoon designing renovations for a mirage. The annual Wapello County Agricultural Banquet was held every November in the high school gymnasium. The space always smelled faintly of floor wax and roasted chicken, a strange mixture that signaled the end of the harvest season. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the folding tables covered in cheap white plastic tablecloths. This was the social pinnacle of our rural community. For generations, farmers gathered here to celebrate survival, to swap weather predictions, and to quietly gauge who had prospered and who was edging toward bankruptcy. For my parents, this event was not about community. It was a coronation. I walked through the double doors a few steps behind my family, wearing a simple charcoal blazer and dark slacks. My father wore a tailored navy suit that cost more than a replacement auger for the combine. My mother walked beside him in a modest but sharply cut burgundy dress, her pearls catching the overhead light. And then there was Vanessa. She wore a silk emerald wrap dress and sleek ankle boots, looking like a fashion magazine editor who had taken a wrong turn on her way to a metropolitan gala. We entered the gymnasium and the performance began immediately. My father threw his shoulders back, puffing out his chest. He navigated the crowded room with the practiced ease of a local politician, shaking hands and slapping backs. The town viewed Richard Granger as a titan of industry. They saw the new grain silos, the state-of-the-art machinery, and the pristine fences lining the county highway. They assumed he was the mastermind behind the 7-figure enterprise. He believed his own myth. It was a fascinating psychological delusion to witness. He had spent the last 15 years sitting in his armchair watching sports television while I negotiated seed prices and calculated nitrogen inputs. Yet when Old Man Henderson gripped his hand and congratulated him on the record-breaking corn yields this season, my father did not hesitate. He smiled warmly and thanked the man, taking full credit for the sweat he never shed. My mother played her part perfectly, standing slightly behind him, projecting the image of a devoted matriarch. When a photographer from the county newspaper approached, asking for a picture the three of them grouped together, instinctively, my father stood tall, his expression severe and dignified. My mother stood beside him, her face set in a stoic, proud gaze. They looked exactly like the figures in the American Gothic painting, rigid, obsessed with their image, desperate to project heartland royalty to a town that did not know the foundation was rotting beneath their feet. I stood near the punch bowl, keeping my distance. I preferred the periphery. From the edge of the room, the details became sharper. I watched Vanessa interacting with the locals. She carried a plastic cup of cheap red wine, pinching it by the very edge of the rim as if the plastic itself might infect her. A neighboring dairy farmer, a kind man named Elias, walked up to introduce himself. He extended a hand, rough and stained from decades of labor. Vanessa hesitated. Her eyes darted to the dirt clinging to the tread of his work boots. She offered a tight, rigid smile and barely grazed his fingers before pulling her hand back to wipe it discreetly on a cocktail napkin. She was disgusted by the very people she planned to exploit. She intended to market the rustic charm of rural Iowa to wealthy executives, selling them the illusion of farm life, while actively repulsed by the reality of it. Eventually, we were directed to our assigned seating. The Granger family was given a prominent spot near the front stage, right next to the local bank manager and the county commissioner. I took the seat at the very far end of the long folding table, putting as much physical space between myself and my father as the seating arrangement allowed. Dinner was served, a heavy meal of mashed potatoes, roast beef, and green beans. I ate quietly, listening to the cacophony of voices echoing off the cinder block walls. The conversation at our end of the table turned to next year's planting projections. Elias, the dairy farmer, leaned across the table, looking past my father to address me directly. "You pulled off a miracle in that south field this year, Abby," he said, his voice carrying over the clatter of silverware. "The soil quality over there was always poor, but your stalks look thicker than anything else in the county. What is your strategy for the spring rotation?" I opened my mouth to explain the cover crop integration I had been testing, but my father cut me off before I could utter a single syllable. "We are changing directions next season, Elias," my father announced, his voice booming over the table, ensuring everyone nearby could hear. "Abigail has done fine work keeping things tidy, but Vanessa is moving back from Chicago to manage the estate. She is taking over the yields. She has a brilliant corporate strategy to bring the Granger property into the modern era." The table grew quiet. Elias looked confused, his brow furrowing. He glanced at Vanessa, who was busy inspecting her manicure, then back to me. Taking over the yields, he echoed politely, "That is a tall order. The dirt out here does not care much about corporate strategy." My father chuckled, a condescending sound that grated against my eardrums. "Oh, we have big plans. Vanessa is going to maximize the footprint. We are transitioning the premium fields." Every eye at the table shifted toward me, waiting for a reaction. They expected me to defend my territory. They expected the dutiful farmhand to show frustration at being replaced by the city sister. My mother stared at me, gripping her fork, a silent warning to keep my mouth shut and preserve the family image. I set my knife down. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. I looked at Elias, then shifted my gaze to my father. I offered a tight, polite smile that conveyed zero warmth. "We will see what the boundaries allow," I said. My father frowned, slightly missing the lethal precision of the statement. He assumed I was talking about zoning laws or county permits. He gave a dismissive wave of his hand and turned back to the commissioner, launching into a loud monologue about property values. I returned to my meal, cutting my roast beef with methodical calm. My silence at that banquet was not submission. It was a strategic retreat. In the art of war, you do not interrupt your enemy when they are making a fatal mistake. You let them talk. You let them boast to the entire town. You let them build their towering castles out of sand, knowing you are the one holding the deed to the beach. They wanted to parade Vanessa around as the new heir to $1 million empire. They wanted to strip my identity and hand it to a woman who wiped her hands after touching a farmer. I watched them bask in the unearned respect of the community, absorbing the glow of a legacy they were actively trying to steal. Let them enjoy the chicken dinner. Let them enjoy the flash of the local newspaper camera. Because the weekend was approaching and the premium fields they were bragging about did not belong to the Granger family trust. As I chewed my food, my mind drifted to the steel safe sitting in my locked office. The quiet reality of property law was about to crash into their performative fantasy, and when my father drove to the bank on Monday morning to cut off my access to the operational funds, he was going to discover just how empty his kingdom really was. The morning after the banquet, I sat in the quiet isolation of my office inside the pole barn. The space smelled of motor oil and old paper, a comforting aroma that grounded me. My desk was a sturdy metal slab salvaged from a defunct auto shop, piled high with yield reports and seed catalogs. But today, my attention was focused on a heavy steel fireproof safe tucked beneath the window. I entered the combination, the mechanical clicks echoing in the stillness. The heavy door swung open, revealing stacks of meticulously organized manila folders. I reached past the operational ledgers and pulled out a specific file secured with a thick rubber band. The label read, "Henderson Parcel Acquisition." I carried it to the desk and laid it flat, smoothing my hand over the rough cardboard. This folder was the culmination of half a decade of silent strategy. It was the trap I had set 5 years ago when the illusion of my father's competence finally fractured beyond repair. The story of this folder began during a brutally dry summer. The neighboring farmer, a quiet widow named Mrs. Henderson, had decided to sell her 300-acre parcel. It was prime real estate, fertile, well-drained, and directly adjacent to our property. My father wanted it desperately. He spent weeks talking about how acquiring the Henderson land would cement the Granger legacy. He drew up grand plans for expanding the corn rotation and integrating a new soybean cycle. There was just one problem. My father's credit score was abysmal. He had spent years opening high-interest lines of credit to fund unnecessary upgrades to the farmhouse, while ignoring the actual operational debt. When he walked into the county bank to secure a mortgage for the Henderson parcel, the loan officer did not even need to run the numbers. They denied him immediately, citing his history of late payments and over-leveraged assets. My father returned home, furious, cursing the bank and blaming the struggling agricultural economy for his own financial mismanagement. He assumed the land would be sold to a corporate conglomerate. He never considered that the solution was sitting right across the dinner table. For years, I had been quietly siphoning a legitimate percentage of the farm's profits into my own accounts. I was the one managing the books, negotiating the contracts, and driving the yields. I took a modest salary, carefully documented, leaving enough in the main accounts to keep my father satisfied, while I built my own war chest. When the Henderson parcel went to public auction, I did not tell my parents. I attended the auction via a proxy, a trusted agricultural attorney from a neighboring county. I bought the 300 acres outright using a combination of my saved capital and a commercial loan secured solely by Granger Agricultural Solutions, LLC. My father celebrated when he heard the land had been purchased by a local entity, assuming we could eventually lease it or absorb it into our rotation. He never asked to see the deed. He never questioned the mechanics of the transaction. He just assumed that because he was the patriarch, the universe would naturally align with his desires. But buying the premium fields was only the first layer of the strategy. The real revelation occurred during the mandatory topographical survey required for the commercial loan. The surveyor, a meticulous professional named Tom, spent 3 days mapping the property lines, tracing the original 19th century markers. When he delivered the final report, he sat down in my office and pointed to a jagged discrepancy on the map. The original Granger farm boundaries, drawn decades before my father inherited the land, were a chaotic mess of shifting creek beds and degraded stone markers. In the 1980s, my father decided to expand the operation. He built the massive new grain silos, installed the high-capacity irrigation systems, and added a sprawling addition to the farmhouse. He did all of this without commissioning a new survey, relying on an outdated map and his own arrogant assumptions about where his property ended. He was wrong. He was spectacularly, legally wrong. Tom the surveyor traced a neon yellow highlighter across the plat map, illustrating the true boundary line. The original 10-acre Granger parcel, the land my parents actually held the deed to, was nothing more than a narrow, barren strip of low-lying swamp near the county road. It was prone to flooding, useless for cultivation, and completely devoid of any valuable infrastructure. The sprawling farmhouse addition, the million-dollar grain silos, the central equipment yard, and the premium irrigation pumps, they were all built directly across the property line. They sat squarely on the Henderson parcel, the land I now owned exclusively. I stared at the map for a long time, absorbing the magnitude of my father's blunder. He had spent decades building his kingdom on someone else's dirt. When I purchased the Henderson parcel, I did not just acquire 300 acres of prime farmland. I legally acquired the footprint of my parents' entire life. I thanked the surveyor, paid his invoice, and locked the stamped documents in my safe. For 5 years I kept the secret. I paid the property taxes on the corrected boundary lines, ensuring my legal claim was ironclad. I watched my father strut around the farm barking orders and boasting about his estate, completely unaware that he was a trespasser on his own perceived legacy. I waited, knowing that eventually his arrogance would force my hand. I untied the rubber band and opened the folder. The pristine county-stamped survey documents lay inside, crisp and undeniable. The topographical maps clearly delineated the boundaries, showing the farmhouse bisected by the neon line. I traced the boundary with my fingertip, feeling the weight of the paper. My parents were trying to give Vanessa a $1.2 million empire they did not possess. They were attempting to deed away land that had belonged to me for half a decade. I closed the folder and slipped it into my canvas messenger bag. The quitclaim deed my father had demanded I sign was still sitting on the dining room table, unsigned and irrelevant. They thought they could erase 15 years of my labor with a single signature. They thought they could discard me and hand the keys to the golden child. I zipped the messenger bag shut. The mechanical defense was ready. The heavy machinery was safely locked in my pole barn. The legal defense was secured in my bag. I stepped out of the office and locked the door behind me. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of impending winter. I looked toward the farmhouse where my mother was likely pouring coffee and Vanessa was likely finalizing her agritourism proposals. They were so confident in their authority, so certain of their impending victory, they had no idea that the ground beneath their feet had shifted years ago. And as I walked toward my truck to check the western fence line, I knew the next confrontation was inevitable. My father, having failed to lock me out of the equipment barn, would inevitably escalate his tactics. He would target the one area he believed he still controlled completely, the financial accounts. He would drive into town, march into the bank, and attempt to freeze the operational funds, intending to starve me out. He would demand the manager cut off my access, assuming his name carried enough weight to override any banking protocol. I climbed into the cab of my truck, turning the ignition and letting the engine idle. I smiled, a cold, tight expression. He was about to learn a very harsh lesson about corporate structure and the danger of ignoring the fine print. Monday morning arrived with a bitter frost that coated the remaining stalks in the fields like spun glass. I was already 2 hours into my day drinking black coffee from a thermos while reviewing the weekly diesel consumption logs in my office. Through the frost-smeared window of the pole barn, I watched my father's silver truck tear down the gravel driveway, fishtailing slightly as he accelerated toward the county highway. He was driving with purpose. I knew exactly where he was going. The relocation of the $1 million equipment the previous week had wounded his pride, exposing the physical limits of his authority. Now he was reaching for the invisible levers of power. He was going to cut off my lifeblood. He was driving to the Wapello County Bank to freeze the operational accounts. In my father's mind, money was the ultimate disciplinarian. Financial control was the quiet violence patriarchs used to ensure loyalty. He believed he held the purse strings to the entire Granger operation. He expected to walk into the bank, demand the accounts be locked, and return home to watch me surrender, unable to buy fuel for the tractors or pay the seasonal hands. He did not know the purse had been empty for years. 20 minutes later, my father marched through the glass doors of the local bank branch. The teller, a young woman named Sarah, who had gone to high school with Vanessa, smiled politely and directed him toward the branch manager's office. David Miller, the bank manager, had known our family for 2 decades. He was a soft-spoken man who preferred to avoid conflict. But today, conflict had walked right into his office and sat heavily in the leather guest chair. I need a full freeze placed on all operational accounts associated with the Granger farm, my father demanded, before David could even offer him a cup of coffee. My daughter is acting erratically, and I suspect she is attempting to misappropriate funds. I want her access revoked immediately. David adjusted his glasses, looking uncomfortable. He tapped a few keys on his keyboard, bringing up the client profiles. "Richard," he began, his voice cautious, "I am afraid I cannot process a freeze order based on a verbal request, especially regarding accounts where you are not the primary authorized signer." My father scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "I am the patriarch of this family, David. The farm is in my name. The accounts were opened under my supervision. Just pull up the main operational ledger and lock it down." David sighed. He turned his monitor slightly so my father could see the screen. Richard, the original Granger family joint account, the one you established 20 years ago, is still active. However, the current balance is $1,842. You have full authorization over that account. I can freeze it if you wish. My father stared at the screen, his brow furrowing in confusion. 1,000? What are you talking about? Where are the harvest deposits from last month? Where is the federal crop insurance payout? We cleared nearly $500,000 in gross revenue this quarter. David cleared his throat, tapping the keyboard again. Those funds are not deposited into this account, Richard. All major operational revenues, vendor contracts, and insurance payouts for the farm are routed directly into the commercial accounts of Granger Agricultural Solutions, LLC. My father's face darkened. Granger Agricultural Solutions. That is just the corporate umbrella we set up for tax purposes. I am the owner. Pull up those accounts and freeze them, Richard David said, leaning forward, clasping his hands on the desk. You are not listed as an owner, a managing member, or an authorized signatory on that LLC. Abigail Granger is the sole managing member. The corporate structure was established entirely under her name 5 years ago. I cannot grant you access to those accounts. You have no legal standing to freeze them or view the balances. The silence in the manager's office was absolute. My father sat frozen, staring at the monitor as the reality of his financial impotence finally registered. He had spent the last 5 years boasting about his wealth, driving his shiny truck, and acting like a king, while completely oblivious to the fact that his daughter had systematically insulated the entire financial engine of the farm from his reckless spending. I demand to see the corporate filings, he shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet bank lobby, causing Sarah, the teller, to jump. She is embezzling my money. She stole my farm. David shook his head, maintaining his professional composure. I cannot release client documents to unauthorized individuals, Richard. If you believe a crime has been committed, you will need to retain legal counsel and seek a court order. But as far as this institution is concerned, Abigail Granger is the sole proprietor of those funds. My father stood up so quickly his chair tipped backward, crashing against the wall. He stormed out of the bank, his face burning with a furious, humiliating rage. An hour later, I heard his truck roar back up the driveway. The tires spun, spraying gravel against the side of the house as he slammed on the brakes. I stepped out of the pole barn, pulling my jacket tight against the wind, holding a leather-bound ledger in my hands. He marched across the yard, his fists clenched, his breath coming in ragged, visible puffs in the freezing air. You thief, he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You ungrateful, scheming thief! I stopped near the edge of the driveway, waiting for him to close the distance. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I went to the bank, he yelled, stopping a few feet away, vibrating with rage. You locked me out of my own money. You stole the harvest. You stole the insurance payouts. I will have you arrested for embezzlement. I will see you in a federal prison, Abigail. I opened the leather-bound ledger, calmly, turning to the first page. Embezzlement, Richard. Is that what you think happened? Yes, he spat. You siphoned my profits into some secret company to steal my legacy. I looked up from the ledger, meeting his furious gaze with absolute, icy precision. You cannot embezzle from a company you built with your own 2 hands, Dad. I said, the word dropping like a stone. I didn't steal your money. I just stopped letting you take mine. He opened his mouth to shout again, but no words came out. The truth was a physical blow. When the bank was threatening to foreclose on your original 40 acres 15 years ago, I stepped in. I explained, my voice cutting through the cold wind. I paid off your back taxes. I secured the seed loans because your credit was destroyed. For a decade, I put my blood into this dirt while you sat on the porch taking the credit. But 5 years ago, when you wanted to buy the Henderson parcel and the bank laughed you out of the lobby, I realized you were going to drag me down with you. I stepped closer to him, closing the ledger with a sharp snap. So I formed the LLC, I continued. I put my name on the operational risks and my name on the rewards. Every tractor you bragged about, every silo you claimed as your own, was financed by my company. You thought I was your obedient farmhand, dutifully depositing my sweat into your account. But I was building a firewall to protect my life's work from your incompetence. You had no right, he whispered, his voice hoarse. This is my family. This is my land. You surrendered your right to this operation the day you decided my labor was expendable, I replied softly. You wanted to give my 15 years of work to Vanessa so she could build luxury cabins. You thought you could cut off my access to the bank today to force my hand. But you found out the truth, Richard. You are broke. The only money you have left is the $1,800 sitting in an account I stopped using 5 years ago. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer, unadulterated hatred. He was a patriarch stripped of his power, standing in the cold, realizing his entire identity was a hollow shell, funded by the daughter he was trying to discard. I turned away from him, walking back toward the pole barn. The financial sabotage had failed. The physical lockout had failed. I knew what would happen next. Cornered and humiliated, he would return to the house and enlist Vanessa. They would abandon brute force and pivot to legal intimidation, hoping a flashy city lawyer could frighten a rural farmer into submission. They were preparing to escalate the war, and I was ready for the next battle. The farmhouse kitchen smelled of stale coffee and impending combat. It was late Thursday afternoon. I had just walked in from inspecting the grain elevator when I saw them waiting for me. My father stood near the refrigerator, arms crossed over his chest, projecting an air of manufactured confidence that had vanished during our confrontation at the bank. My mother sat at the small breakfast table, leafing through a magazine with exaggerated casualness. Vanessa was leaning against the marble kitchen island, holding a ceramic mug of coffee, her taupe cashmere replaced by a sharp-tailored blazer. And standing right beside her was a man I had never seen before. He was in his late 40s, wearing a charcoal suit that was entirely too expensive and too pristine for a rural Iowa farmhouse. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the overhead fluorescent lights. He held a thick black leather briefcase resting it on the marble island as if claiming the territory. This was the heavy hitter, the city muscle my sister had imported to break the rural farmer she assumed was too ignorant to understand legal intimidation. Abigail, Vanessa said, setting her mug down. We need to have a serious conversation. This is Julian Vance. He represents the investment group backing my agritourism project. Julian Vance offered a smile that contained zero warmth. He did not extend a hand to shake. He simply popped the latches on his briefcase, the sound sharp and metallic in the quiet kitchen. Miss Granger, Julian began, his voice smooth and practiced. We are here to expedite the transition of this property. Your father has informed us of the rather unconventional corporate structures you established. While we appreciate your efforts to manage the operational risks, we need to consolidate the assets under a unified family trust to secure the necessary commercial zoning permits. He pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and slapped them down onto the marble island. The sound was loud, aggressive, designed to startle. This is a master quitclaim and asset transfer agreement, Julian continued, tapping the top page with a gold fountain pen. It formally unwinds Granger Agricultural Solutions, LLC, and transfers all operational assets, equipment, titles, and land rights to the newly formed Granger Heritage Trust, which your sister Vanessa will manage. I looked at the stack of papers. A master quitclaim. They were trying to steal everything in one sweeping, aggressive motion. The physical lockout had failed. The bank sabotage had failed. Now they were attempting to bury me under an avalanche of legal jargon, hoping I would fold under the pressure of a Chicago litigator. I walked over to the island, my steel-toed boots thudding against the hardwood floor. I did not say a word. I picked up the document. The crisp white paper felt foreign against the rough calluses of my hands. The dirt from the fields was still embedded under my fingernails, a stark contrast to the sterile legal threats printed on the page. And if I refused to sign this, I asked, my voice even barely above a whisper. Julian Vance's smile widened slightly, shifting from patronizing to predatory. I strongly advise against that course of action, Miss Granger. If you refuse to cooperate, we will immediately file an injunction against your LLC. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the island, invading my space. We will argue that you operated this farm under deceptive practices. We will claim you breached fiduciary duties to your parents, systematically hiding assets and manipulating a vulnerable elderly couple to enrich yourself. We will tie you up in endless litigation in federal court. We will freeze your assets during discovery, and we will bleed your little company dry with legal fees before you ever see the inside of a courtroom. It was a masterful bluff, a classic tactic used by aggressive corporate lawyers to steamroll opponents who lacked the resources to fight a protracted legal battle. He was threatening to destroy my reputation, bankrupt my company, and drag my name through the mud using the very parents I had saved from ruin as the primary witnesses against me. In the background, Vanessa took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. She was smirking. She looked at me with an expression of absolute triumph, convinced that she had finally outmaneuvered the stubborn sister who refused to surrender the kingdom. My father stood taller, visibly emboldened by Julian's aggressive posturing. My mother turned a page in her magazine, pretending she was not actively participating in the execution of her youngest daughter. They expected me to break. They expected the uneducated farm girl to crumble under the weight of a Chicago attorney threatening federal lawsuits. They thought I would panic cry or desperately try to negotiate a settlement that would leave me with nothing. They fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I was not just a farmer who knew how to drive a tractor. I was a meticulous businesswoman who had negotiated million-dollar vendor contracts and navigated complex agricultural subsidies. I had built a corporate fortress while they were playing dress-up. I continued reading the document, scanning the clauses and the specific legal coordinates listed in the asset transfer section. Julian had clearly used the original deed coordinates my father provided, the coordinates for the 10-acre swamp. I reached the signature page. I stared at the blank line waiting for my name. "Miss Granger," Julian said, his tone sharp, pressing for submission. "I suggest you sign. We can make this a smooth transition, or we can make it incredibly painful. The choice, yours." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my character against his baseless accusations of elder abuse. I simply aligned the edges of the document, ensuring the thick stack was perfectly neat. I slid the unsigned paperwork back across the cold marble island, pushing it directly into Julian Vance's chest. I looked the slick Chicago lawyer dead in the eye, holding his gaze until the predatory smile faltered. "You didn't run a title search on the adjacent lots, did you, Julian?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm, dripping with absolute certainty. Julian blinked, his professional composure cracking for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me. A master quitclaim is only effective if the grantor actually holds the title to the assets being claimed," I stated, leaning against the island, mirroring Vanessa's casual posture. "You are threatening to sue me for breaching fiduciary duties over the original Granger parcel, but you are attempting to claim assets that do not reside on that parcel." My father stepped forward, his face flushing red. "Stop talking in circles, Abigail. Sign the paper." I ignored my father, keeping my eyes locked on the lawyer. "If you had done your due diligence, Julian, you would know that the original Granger property lines are severely degraded. You drafted a quitclaim based on my father's assumptions, not the county records." Julian frowned, glancing at the document, then back at me. "We have the original deed." "You have a deed to 10 acres of useless marshland," I corrected him softly. "The premium crop fields, the new silos, the equipment yard, and the exact footprint of this very kitchen we are standing in do not belong to Richard Granger. They are physically located on the Henderson parcel, a parcel that I purchased outright 5 years ago." Vanessa's smirk vanished instantly. She set her coffee mug down with a sharp clatter. "What is she talking about? Julian?" Julian's face tightened. He looked at my father, who was suddenly looking very confused and very panicked. "I am talking about geography, Vanessa," I said, turning to my sister. "I am talking about the fact that your high-priced lawyer just handed me a threat to seize a $1 million operation based on a topographical error. I own the dirt under your boots. I own the porch your architects measured, and I own the fields you promised your investors." The silence in the kitchen was heavier than a summer storm. Julian Vance, the heavy hitter from Chicago, stared at the quitclaim deed, realizing he had just threatened a landowner without verifying the boundaries of the battlefield. "You are bluffing," my father whispered, his voice shaking. "You cannot own the land under this house." I pushed away from the island and walked toward the hallway. "I am not bluffing, Richard. But since you prefer to do things the hard way, I suggest you prepare for an audience. I know exactly what your next move is. You are going to call the entire family to this house on Sunday to shame me into submission. You are going to turn this into a public tribunal." I stopped at the doorway and looked back at the 4 of them standing frozen in the kitchen. "Bring them all," I said. "Invite the aunts, the uncles, and the cousins, because when I finally show you the stamped county surveys, I want the entire Granger family to watch the empire fall." The fallout from the kitchen confrontation was immediate and predictable. My parents did not apologize. They did not verify the county records or fire Julian Vance for his sheer incompetence. Instead, they chose the path of maximum collateral damage. They activated the network. By Saturday afternoon, the farmhouse driveway was lined with vehicles, SUVs, pickup trucks, and a pristine luxury sedan belonging to my Uncle Robert, who had driven up from Des Moines. My parents had orchestrated an emergency family meeting. This was not a gathering to share a meal or catch up on local gossip. It was a tribunal, a public shaming designed to weaponize the collective guilt of the Granger bloodline against the one daughter who refused to kneel. I parked my truck near the pole barn and walked toward the main house. The autumn air was heavy with the smell of wood smoke and approaching rain. I could hear the murmur of voices echoing from the living room before I even opened the front door. I stepped into the entryway and the conversation abruptly ceased. 15 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My Aunt Martha Diane's sister sat on the floral sofa, clutching a tissue. Uncle Robert stood near the fireplace, holding a tumbler of bourbon, projecting an air of weary authority. Cousins I had not seen since Thanksgiving sat on folding chairs looking extremely uncomfortable. Vanessa was positioned near the center of the room, looking appropriately distressed. My father stood behind her, resting a supportive hand on her shoulder, playing the role of the embattled patriarch trying to keep his family intact. No one greeted me. No one offered a smile. The verdict had already been decided before I walked through the door. "Abigail," my father began, his tone heavy with manufactured sorrow, "we have brought everyone together today because the situation has become untenable. You have chosen to escalate a simple property transition into a malicious attack on this family. We can no longer handle this privately." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my canvas jacket. "A malicious attack. Is that what you told them, Richard?" Aunt Martha dabbed at her eyes with the tissue. "Oh, Abby, how could you?" she wailed, her voice trembling with theatrical grief. "Tearing this family apart over some dirt? Your parents gave you everything. They let you run the farm for years, and this is how you repay them? Threatening them with lawsuits, refusing to step aside for your sister?" I let her cry. I did not bother explaining that I was the one who had been threatened with a lawsuit by Vanessa's Chicago lawyer. They only knew the narrative my father had carefully constructed, the narrative where I was an ungrateful, erratic tenant trying to steal a legacy. Uncle Robert swirled the bourbon in his glass, taking a step forward. "Now listen here, Abby. You have had a good run. We all appreciate the hard work you put in keeping things tidy while Vanessa was getting her education. But it is time to be realistic. Vanessa has a real business plan. She has investors. She is going to build something substantial for the Granger name. You should be grateful your father allowed you to play farmer for so long. It is time to let the adults handle the estate." Play farmer. I looked at Robert, noting his polished shoes and his soft manicured hands. He managed a mid-level insurance agency in the suburbs and had not lifted anything heavier than a golf club in 20 years. Yet here he was lecturing me about a multi-million-dollar agricultural operation I had built from the brink of foreclosure. I did not interrupt him. I absorbed the insult, filing it away in the cold, quiet ledger I kept in my mind. The room erupted into a chorus of overlapping voices. Cousins urged me to apologize. An older aunt muttered something about my lack of respect for tradition. They threw words at me like stones trying to bruise my resolve. They demanded submission. They demanded I sign the quitclaim deed Julian Vance had prepared, ignoring the fact that the deed was functionally useless. My mother sat silently in an armchair watching the spectacle unfold. She was the architect of this specific type of cruelty, letting others do the screaming while she maintained her pristine image. I stood by the doorway, letting the noise wash over me. I looked at each face, cataloging exactly who had chosen to stand with my father. I noted the cousins who looked away, unable to meet my gaze, and the aunts who nodded aggressively in agreement with Robert's condescending lecture. I was absorbing the betrayal of my entire bloodline. For 15 years I had believed that if I worked hard enough, I could earn their respect. I thought the Granger name meant something honorable. But standing in that living room, I realized they did not respect the labor. They only respected the illusion of power my father projected. They preferred a comfortable lie to an uncomfortable truth. The voices eventually died down, running out of breath in arguments. The room settled into a heavy, expectant silence. They were waiting for the break. They were waiting for the tears, the apologies, the desperate plea for forgiveness. My father stepped away from Vanessa, walking into the center of the room. He puffed his chest out, preparing to deliver the final blow. He believed the combined weight of the family tribunal had crushed my resistance. "I am going to give you one last chance, Abigail," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You are going to sign the deed Julian prepared. You are going to apologize to your mother and your sister. You will vacate the premises by Monday morning. If you refuse, you are dead to this family. You will be cut off completely. No contact, no inheritance, nothing." He stared at me, his jaw set, daring me to challenge him. The room held its breath. Aunt Martha stopped crying. Uncle Robert set his bourbon glass down on the mantel. Vanessa leaned forward, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. They all expected me to fold. They expected the crushing weight of total isolation to force my hand. I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had driven his farm into the ground, the man who had locked me out of my own equipment, the man who had tried to freeze my bank accounts, and the man who had just publicly disowned me in front of 15 relatives. The emotional debt was fully paid. I felt nothing but a sharp, crystalline clarity. The time for maneuvering was over. I reached into the inner pocket of my canvas jacket. I felt the smooth surface of the thick manila folder I had retrieved from my safe earlier that morning. I pulled it out, holding it loosely in my right hand. I walked slowly away from the doorframe, moving into the center of the room. The silence was so profound I could hear the creak of the floorboards under my boots. I stopped directly in front of the coffee table, where Vanessa's unsigned quitclaim deed still sat next to a tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I looked around the room, making eye contact with every single person who had just condemned me. Then I set the manila folder directly on top of the quitclaim deed. The silence in the living room was so absolute, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. 15 members of the Granger family watched as I dropped the thick manila folder onto the coffee table. It landed with a dull thud, directly covering the pristine white pages of the quitclaim deed Julian Vance had drafted. My father stared at the plain cardboard cover, his jaw set in a rigid line of defiance. He still believed he held the high ground. He assumed I was handing over a collection of old receipts or meaningless operational logs in a desperate attempt to justify my value to the family. "Since we are doing this in front of an audience," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying across the quiet room, "you should probably look at this first." My father scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. He reached down and ripped the folder open, tearing the cardboard flap in his haste. He snatched the first document from the stack. It was the official property tax assessment from the county assessor's office for the current fiscal year. I had carefully highlighted the parcel identification number and the corresponding legal coordinates. "What is this nonsense, Abigail?" he demanded, waving the paper in the air. "I do not care about your tax projections. I told you to sign the deed." "Keep reading, Richard," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. "Look at the name listed under the registered owner." He frowned, looking back down at the document. His eyes scanned the highlighted section. He blinked once, then twice. His ruddy complexion, the color of a man who spent his life barking orders under the Iowa sun, began to pale. He dropped the tax assessment and grabbed the next document in the stack. It was the deed of trust for the Henderson parcel, registered 5 years ago, bearing the official raised seal of the Wapello County Recorder. Vanessa, who had been sitting on the edge of the sofa, projecting an air of bored superiority, suddenly leaned forward. She peered over my father's shoulder, trying to read the dense legal text. The arrogant smirk that had been permanently plastered on her face since she arrived from Chicago started to slip. "What does it say?" Vanessa asked, her voice lacking its usual confident edge. My father did not answer her. His hands were beginning to shake. He flipped through the stack of papers, pulling out the topographical survey maps. I had commissioned a secondary map, highlighting the exact boundary lines in neon orange ink. The map clearly showed the original 10-acre Granger parcel as a narrow sliver of land near the highway. The sprawling farmhouse, the main equipment yard, the new grain silos, and the vast expanse of premium crop fields were all located decisively on the adjacent 300-acre plot. He stared at the neon orange line bisecting the map, separating the kingdom he thought he owned from the reality of the dirt he actually stood on. The paper trembled in his grip. My mother, sensing the sudden shift in the room, stood up from her armchair. "Richard," she said sharply, "what is it? What did she give you?" My father looked up from the map. His eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying combination of shock, confusion, and profound realization. The illusion of his patriarchy, the myth of his legacy, was shattering in real time right in front of the entire family. "What did you do?" He whispered the words, scraping against his throat. The aunts and uncles shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the collapse of the power dynamic they had come to enforce. Uncle Robert set his bourbon glass down, completely forgetting his condescending lecture from 5 minutes earlier. "I didn't do anything, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "I just bought the land you built your house on." A collective gasp echoed through the living room. Aunt Martha pressed a hand to her chest, her theatrical grief replaced by genuine astonishment. "That is impossible," my father stammered, dropping the survey map onto the table as if it burned his fingers. "The farmhouse is on Granger land. My grandfather built this house." "Your grandfather built a small cabin on the original plot," I corrected him, stepping closer to the coffee table. "But when you expanded the foundation in the 1980s, when you built the new barns and installed the commercial irrigation systems, you never bothered to hire a surveyor. You just built wherever you pleased, assuming the boundaries matched your ambition. They did not." I pointed to the neon line on the map. "You built your entire operation across the property line. You built it on the Henderson parcel." Vanessa snatched the map from the table, her manicured fingernails digging into the paper. "This is a forgery," she declared, turning to her father. "She faked these documents." Julian pulled the deed for the Granger estate. "We have the legal description." "Julian pulled the deed for the 10-acre swamp, Vanessa," I said, turning to face my sister. "The 10 acres that Richard legally owns. But the 300 acres of premium crop fields you promised your Chicago investors, the fields you were planning to bulldoze for your luxury cabins, they belong to me. I bought them 5 years ago when the bank refused to give Richard a loan because he had destroyed his credit." I gestured to the stack of documents. "The deed is recorded, the taxes are paid, the property lines are legally established." Vanessa stared at the map, reading the coordinates and tracing the boundary lines. The reality of the situation washed over her in a wave of cold panic. Her entire business plan, her multi-million-dollar agritourism project, her leverage with the city investors, it was all built on a topographical error. She was attempting to develop a property she had zero legal claim to. "This cannot be right," my mother interjected, her voice rising in pitch. "We pay the property taxes every year on this house." "You pay the taxes on the original parcel, Diane," it clarified. "I have been paying the taxes on the farmhouse, the silos, and the premium fields for the last 5 years. I let you live here. I let you pretend you were still the master of the estate because it was easier than dealing with your pride." I looked back at my father. He was staring at the coffee table, his chest heaving, his mind desperately trying to find a loophole in the airtight trap I had sprung. "But you wanted to force my hand," I continued, my voice devoid of any pity. "You wanted to lock me out of my own equipment. You tried to freeze my bank accounts, and tonight you invited the entire family here to disown me if I did not hand over my life's work to a sister who hates the smell of dirt." I reached down and tapped the thick manila folder. "You wanted a legal transfer, Richard. You got one." The silence that followed was suffocating. The 15 relatives who had spent the last hour demanding my submission were now staring at my father, waiting for him to offer a defense. They were waiting for the patriarch to reassert his authority. But Richard Granger had nothing left to say. He was a king without a kingdom, sitting in a house he did not own, surrounded by a family that was witnessing his total defeat. Vanessa dropped the survey map onto the floor. She grabbed her phone from her purse, her hands shaking violently. "I need to call Julian," she muttered, her voice tight with panic. "We need to file an injunction. We need to stop her." "You can call whoever you want, Vanessa," I said, turning toward the front door. "But you should probably tell your investors that the Granger estate you promised them is currently a useless bog prone to seasonal flooding." I stopped with my hand on the doorknob and looked back at the stunned, silent room. I had absorbed their betrayal, and I had returned it with mathematical precision. "The county surveyor arrives tomorrow morning at 8, I announced. "I suggest you all be outside to watch. He is going to paint the boundary lines." I opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving my family trapped in the ruins of their own arrogance. The public shaming had ended. The deconstruction of the illusion was complete. Now the only thing left was the physical drawing of the lines, separating the Granger family myth from the cold, hard truth of the Iowa soil. The immediate aftermath of a collapsed illusion is rarely loud. It usually begins with a frantic, desperate search for an alternative reality. Julian Vance, the high-priced Chicago litigator, snatched the manila folder from the coffee table. His polished demeanor entirely vanished. He flipped through the official county documents, his eyes darting across the raised seals and notarized signatures as if hoping to find a smudge that would invalidate the truth. I stood near the front door watching him. His face lost its remaining color, shifting to a pale ashen gray. A lawyer's worst nightmare is discovering that their client has committed to a massive financial development based on fraudulent leverage. Julian was realizing he had just threatened a landowner with federal lawsuits while attempting to claim assets his client had absolutely no legal right to possess. "This cannot be accurate," Julian muttered, his voice lacking its previous venom. "These boundary lines imply the primary structures are encroaching on a separate parcel." "They are not encroaching, Julian," I corrected him, my tone sharp and distinct. "They were built on the wrong side of a degraded property line decades before I acquired the adjacent acreage. I am the sole legal owner of the Henderson parcel. Therefore, the structures located on that parcel are situated on my land." I turned my attention to the 15 relatives still sitting frozen in the living room. The aunts and uncles who had just spent an hour demanding my submission were now staring at my father with a mixture of horror and profound embarrassment. They had gathered to enforce the patriarch's will, only to discover the patriarch was a fraud. "Let me break down the math for everyone," I said, stepping slightly away from the door, ensuring every person in the room could hear me clearly. "Since you all felt entitled to an opinion on my 15 years of labor, you deserve to understand exactly what you were trying to steal." I pointed toward the large bay window that overlooked the western fields. "The 300 acres of premium crop rotation out there belong to me. The $1 million irrigation pumps drawing from the deep well belong to me. The new grain silos, the main equipment yard, and the heavy machinery you thought you could lock me away from belong to Granger Agricultural Solutions, LLC. I shifted my gaze to my mother, who was clutching the armrests of her chair, her knuckles white. "And the exact footprint of this farmhouse, Diane. The kitchen where you demanded I pack my bags. The living room where you gathered this tribunal. It all sits squarely across the boundary line, on my dirt." My father slumped onto the edge of the sofa, looking as if the structural beams of the house were physically crushing him. He covered his face with his hands, his broad shoulders trembling. He was experiencing the total devastation of a man who realized his entire identity, his pride, his reputation in the community, had been a hollow performance funded by the very person he had tried to discard. He was too cheap to commission a proper survey in the 1980s, I explained to the silent audience. He relied on assumptions instead of facts, and when I bought the Henderson property 5 years ago, I simply secured the ground he had recklessly built his life upon. I looked directly at Vanessa. She was standing near the fireplace, her designer blazer suddenly looking absurdly out of place in a room filled with agricultural ledgers and boundary disputes. "You wanted the Granger estate, Vanessa," I said, my voice dropping to a low, decisive register. "Richard wanted to give you the legacy. Well, you can have it." I pointed toward the county highway visible through the front window. "But the Granger estate is exactly 10 acres of low-lying marshland behind the old property line. It floods every spring. It cannot sustain commercial crops, and it definitely cannot support the foundation for luxury cabins. Everything else, the entire $1.2 million operation, belongs to me." The family hierarchy collapsed in that exact second. The rigid structure of obedience and obligation disintegrated, leaving only the stark, terrifying reality of property law. Uncle Robert stood up, grabbing his coat from the hall tree, avoiding my eyes completely. The cousins began whispering frantically among themselves, gathering their belongings, preparing to flee the scene of a disaster they had unwittingly endorsed. Vanessa's shock finally morphed into blind panic. She turned on Julian Vance, her face contorted in a mask of fury. "You told me we had a solid case," she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls. "You told my investors the land was clear for development. If they pull out of this project, I am ruined, Julian. Do something. File an injunction. Freeze her assets." Julian snapped his briefcase shut, refusing to look at my sister. "I cannot file an injunction against a legitimate landowner, Vanessa Dot," he stated flatly, his professional self-preservation kicking in. "We did not run a full title search on the adjacent lots because your father assured me the boundaries were established. My firm cannot proceed with this development plan. You do not own the site." He walked past Vanessa, heading straight for the front door without another word. He was abandoning the sinking ship, leaving the golden child to face the consequences of her own unearned ambition. Vanessa spun toward my father. "Do something, Richard!" she shrieked, reverting to the desperate demands of a spoiled teenager. "Tell her to fix this. Make her sign the land over." My father did not move. He kept his face buried in his hands, utterly defeated. The patriarch, who had threatened to lock me out and cut me off, was now a broken man, sitting in a house he was technically trespassing in. I buttoned my canvas jacket, pulling the collar up against my neck. I had delivered the folder. I had deconstructed the illusion. There was no need for further discussion. "The county surveyor arrives tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp," I announced, addressing the shattered remnants of my family. "He will be drawing the neon lines across the yard. I suggest you all be packed and ready to face reality." I opened the front door and walked out, leaving the chaotic sounds of a collapsing kingdom behind me. The crisp autumn air filled my lungs, tasting sweeter than it had in 15 years. The emotional debt was gone. The trap was sprung. The next morning, the earth itself would testify to my ownership, and the physical lines would separate my thriving empire from my father's barren swamp. The morning sky over Wapello County was a bruised, unforgiving gray. It was the kind of crisp, biting autumn dawn that Iowa produces right before the first true freeze of the season. I stood in the central equipment yard, leaning against the heavy rear tire of my primary John Deere tractor, holding a thermal flask of dark roast coffee. The bitter steam rising from the metal rim warmed my face. I wore my insulated work jacket and steel-toed boots, prepared for a standard day of labor. Across the gravel driveway, my family presented a drastically different portrait. Richard, Diane, and Vanessa stood clustered near the bottom steps of the farmhouse porch. They looked as though they had survived a shipwreck. My father wore a heavy wool coat buttoned incorrectly near the collar, his face drawn and haggard. My mother clutched a quilted jacket tightly around her shoulders, her usual pristine composure entirely erased by a sleepless night of panic. Vanessa was wrapped in a designer trench coat, shivering visibly, her expensive leather boots sinking slightly into the frosted grass. They were waiting for the executioner. At exactly 8 in the morning, the rhythmic crunch of heavy tires rolling over loose gravel broke the morning stillness. A white, heavy-duty pickup truck bearing the official county surveyor emblem turned off the highway and navigated the long approach to the farmhouse. The vehicle came to a halt near the edge of the front lawn. The driver shifted into park, and the diesel engine fell silent, leaving only the sound of the harsh morning wind rattling the barren branches of the oak trees. A man stepped out of the cab. This was Tom, the county surveyor. He wore a high-visibility orange vest over a thick flannel shirt, a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was a professional who dealt in facts, coordinates, and undeniable topography. He carried no emotional investment in the Granger family drama. To him, this was just another work order on a Tuesday schedule. Tom walked to the rear of his truck and lowered the tailgate. He began assembling his equipment, pulling out a heavy tripod, a total station theodolite, and a handheld GPS receiver. Suddenly, another vehicle sped up the driveway, skidding slightly as it parked behind the surveyor truck. Julian Vance, the Chicago litigator, stepped out. He had abandoned the sinking ship the night before, but corporate liability is a relentless motivator. He had clearly spent the night at a local motel and returned this morning not to rescue my sister, but to formally verify the boundary dispute protecting his own law firm from investor lawsuits. His expensive charcoal suit was wrinkled. Despite the biting cold, a thin layer of sweat glazed his forehead. Julian rushed toward Tom, waving a printed document. "Excuse me," he said, his voice frantic and breathless. "Are you the county surveyor? I need you to recalibrate your instruments. We have reason to believe the historical markers for this parcel have been tampered with. I demand a secondary verification before you mark any lines on this property." Tom paused, tightening a leveling screw on his tripod. He looked at Julian, taking in the wrinkled suit and the desperate, sweating face. Then Tom looked past the lawyer, making brief eye contact with me. I offered a single nod. Tom turned his attention back to his equipment. "I calibrate my instruments every morning, Counselor," Tom said, his voice a low, unbothered drawl. "The satellite positioning does not lie, and the county plat maps are a matter of public record. You can stand back or you can stand in your car, but you are not going to interfere with a state-mandated boundary verification." Julian opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer, immovable authority of a civil engineer doing his job silenced the Chicago lawyer. Julian retreated a few steps, pulling out his phone to record the process, desperate to document his own due diligence. Tom hoisted the total station theodolite onto his shoulder and grabbed a canvas bag filled with wooden stakes, a mallet, and several cans of neon orange marking paint. He walked to the far edge of the front lawn, consulting the digital coordinates on his handheld receiver. He moved with methodical purpose, ignoring the 4 people huddled near the porch who were watching him as if he were carrying a ticking bomb. He stopped near a cluster of overgrown lilac bushes. He checked the receiver one more time, verifying the exact longitude and latitude. He reached into his bag and pulled out a sharp wooden stake and placed the pointed tip against the frozen earth. He raised the heavy iron mallet. The first strike echoed across the quiet farm like a judge's gavel falling in an empty courtroom. The sound was sharp, final, and devastating. My father flinched. He physically recoiled as the mallet struck the wood, driving the stake deep into the Iowa soil. Tom struck it 2 more times, ensuring it was immovable. Then he pulled a can of neon orange spray paint from his vest. He shook it, the metal mixing ball rattling loudly, and sprayed a bright, vivid circle around the base of the stake. Tom consulted his receiver again and began walking backward, moving in a perfectly straight line toward the farmhouse. Every 10 feet, he stopped, drove another wooden stake into the ground, and sprayed another burst of neon orange paint. Thud, thud, thud. The rhythm of the mallet became a relentless drumbeat, counting down the final seconds of my father's reign. The line was forming a physical, undeniable barrier, manifesting right across the manicured lawn my mother had spent decades tending. Tom reached the edge of the gravel driveway. He drove a stake directly into the crushed rock. He sprayed the orange paint, marking a division that could never be unwritten. The trajectory of the boundary was ruthless. It did not curve to accommodate my parents' feelings. It did not bend to protect their pride. It drove straight toward the farmhouse. Vanessa let out a small, choked sob as Tom approached the porch. He stopped mere inches from the bottom wooden step. He checked his coordinates, placed a stake in the frozen flower bed, and swung the mallet. The neon orange line now ran parallel to the front of the house, slicing the property with surgical precision. The farmhouse, the front porch, the well, the septic system, the towering silos in the distance, and the vast premium crop fields stretching toward the horizon were all secured on my side of the stakes. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark, bitter liquid warm my throat. I watched 15 years of my stolen labor, 15 years of uncredited sweat and silent endurance being legally cordoned off by a stranger with a can of paint. My father stared at the bright orange string Tom was now running between the stakes, tying them together to form a continuous visual barrier. Richard Granger looked like a ghost. His shoulders slumped, his chest hollowed out. He was watching his entire identity being carved away. The land he had boasted about at banquets, the estate he had used to threaten my compliance, the kingdom he had attempted to hand over to his golden child, was gone. Tom finished tying off the string at the edge of the county highway. He packed his mallet into his canvas bag. He did not offer any apologies. He did not offer condolences. The earth had spoken through the coordinates, and the earth was rejecting the patriarch. The surveyor walked back to his truck, secured his equipment in a bed, and climbed into the cab. The diesel engine roared to life, shattering the heavy silence that had fallen over the yard. He drove away, leaving behind a family permanently divided by a neon orange boundary. Julian Vance lowered his phone. He looked at the line, then looked at Vanessa. His face was a mask of cold, professional detachment. "We are done here, Vanessa," he stated, turning toward his car. "The investors will receive my report by noon. Do not contact my office again." He got into his vehicle and sped down the driveway, leaving my sister standing in the cold, her multi-million-dollar dream dissolving into the morning mist. I screwed the lid onto my thermos and set it on the tire of my tractor. I walked slowly across the gravel, stopping right at the edge of the neon string. My parents and my sister stood on the other side, trapped on the tiny sliver of land they actually owned. The silence stretched between us, fragile and heavy. They were finally seeing the true shape of their domain. But the visual impact of the orange line was only the beginning. The real devastation, the true cost of their arrogance, was waiting just beyond the tree line, waiting for them to finally look at the ground they were left standing on. The surveyor had drawn the map, but they had not yet grasped the sheer uselessness of their remaining territory. The air in the front yard was completely still. Even the biting Iowa wind had died down, leaving a silence so absolute it felt physical. The neon orange line painted across the frosted grass glowed with radioactive intensity. It was no longer a theoretical boundary discussed in a heated living room. It was an undeniable geographic fact. I stood on the safe side of the line, holding my thermal flask, feeling the heat radiating against my palms. On the other side, my father, mother, and sister remained frozen, trapped in a tiny sliver of reality they had never bothered to understand. Before he had driven away, Tom the surveyor had handed a sealed manila envelope to my father. It contained the finalized certified plat map of the 10-acre Granger parcel. My father had clutched the envelope for several minutes, staring blankly at the orange stakes. Now he finally ripped the envelope open, his hands trembling so violently he nearly tore the thick paper. He unfolded the map. Diane leaned in close, her breath pluming in the cold air. Vanessa peered over his shoulder, desperately hoping the visual representation would somehow mitigate the disaster Julian Vance had warned her about. It did not. The map was worse than the neon string. The original Granger parcel, a 10-acre rectangle, was clearly shaded in a dark hatched pattern. It sat entirely in the lowland depression near the county highway. A topographical contour line ran through the center, indicating a significant drop in elevation. This was the area we historically referred to as the South Bog. It was a notoriously wet, barren strip of earth that accumulated runoff from the surrounding fields. It flooded every spring, turning into an impassable mire of mud and stagnant water. There were no structures indicated in the shaded area. The map verified what I had already told them. The farmhouse, the well, the septic leach field, and the towering equipment barns were all cleanly positioned outside the hatched rectangle, residing firmly on the Henderson parcel. "We own the swamp," Vanessa whispered, her voice cracking, the reality finally breaking through her corporate arrogance. "My investors pledged $3 million to develop a rustic retreat, and we hold the deed to a seasonal floodplain." My father did not respond to her. He was staring at the map, his eyes darting frantically from the hatched rectangle to the neon orange line spray-painted mere inches from his front porch. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his entire life projecting the image of a wealthy landowner. He had bullied his neighbors, intimidated his daughter, and boasted at agricultural banquets, and the entire time, his actual domain had been a useless patch of mud. He had no leverage left. He had no money in the bank. He had no heavy machinery. And now he did not even have a foundation to stand on. The aggression that had fueled his actions for the past week, the loud threats and the public shaming, evaporated instantly. When a bully realizes his fists are made of smoke, he immediately pivots to the only tactic remaining: pity. He slowly lowered the map, letting his arms drop to his sides. He looked across the neon line, meeting my gaze. His face softened, his features contorting into an expression of deep, manufactured sorrow. It was the face he used when he wanted my mother to forgive him for a financial blunder. It was the face he used when he needed a favor. "Abby," he said, his voice dropping to a gentle, pleading register, "honey, this has gone too far. We are letting property lines divide us." I did not reply. I took another slow sip of my coffee, watching the performance. "You cannot do this to us, Abigail," he continued, taking a step toward the orange string, but careful not to cross it. "This is the house you grew up in. This is your mother's home. We are your family. You cannot just kick us out into the cold over a surveying error. We can sit down and work this out. We can find a compromise." A compromise. It was a fascinating word coming from a man who had threatened to completely erase my existence 48 hours earlier. I lowered my thermal flask. I did not look at his pleading eyes. Instead, I looked past him, focusing my gaze on the main equipment barn standing in the background. Specifically, I looked at the heavy steel handles of the barn doors. The shiny new hardened steel padlocks he had installed 3 days ago were still dangling from the hasps, glinting in the morning light. Those padlocks were the pebble in the shoe of his sudden affection. They were a permanent, silent reminder of his true nature. When he thought he held all the power, he did not hesitate to lock me out of my livelihood. He did not hesitate to use the law as a weapon to starve me into submission. He only discovered his paternal compassion when the weapon was turned against him. "You disowned me last night, Richard." I said the words precise and cold, dropping the title of Dad forever. "You stood in front of 15 relatives and declared me dead to this family. You told me I was cut off completely." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I was angry, Abby. People say things they do not mean when they are angry. I was just trying to protect your sister's future." "And I am protecting mine," I replied. "You gave Vanessa your property, Richard. You executed a formal transfer of your assets to her corporate trust. That was your decision. You handed her your legacy." I gestured toward the map he was still clutching. "So she can build you a house in the swamp." My mother let out a sharp, strangled gasp. "You are a monster, Abigail. You are throwing your own parents out on the street?" I turned my attention to Diane. "You watched him try to destroy me," I stated, my voice lacking any sympathy. "You watched him try to freeze my bank accounts and steal 15 years of my labor to fund Vanessa's vanity project. You sat in that armchair and did nothing because you preferred the comfort of his lies over the reality of my sweat. You made your choice, Diane. Now you get to live on the land he actually provided for you." I reached into the deep canvas pocket of my work jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper enclosed in a plastic protective sleeve. I walked directly to the neon orange line, stopping so close my boot touched the spray paint. I held the document out across the boundary. My father stared at it, his hands trembling. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It is a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises," I said, keeping my arm extended. "The farmhouse, the detached garage, and the surrounding yard are legally located on my property. You have been residing here as tenants at will. That tenancy is now terminated. You have 30 days to remove your personal belongings and vacate the structures." He did not reach for the paper. He simply stared at it, paralyzed by the finality of the legal instrument. "Take it, Richard," I ordered, my voice hardening. "If you refuse to accept service, I will have the county sheriff deliver it this afternoon. The same sheriff you tried to use to arrest me for accessing my own equipment." He slowly raised a shaking hand and took the plastic sleeve from my grasp. He looked at the bold black letters declaring the eviction notice. The patriarch had been formally dethroned. But the conflict was far from over. Richard and Diane were broken on, their pride shattered by the relentless application of the law. But Vanessa was a different entity entirely. She had not invested 15 years in the soil, but she had staked her entire corporate reputation and significant investor capital on a project that was now dead on arrival. As my father stared at the eviction notice, Vanessa's panic began to calcify into a desperate, toxic rage. She realized that the golden child status which had protected her for her entire life held zero currency in the harsh reality of property rights. The family she had manipulated was ruined, and the sister she had underestimated held all the cards. She was about to realize exactly how isolated she truly was, and her reaction would sever the final decaying threads of the Granger family dynamic. The departure of the surveyor left a vacuum in the front yard. The chaotic energy of the morning, the desperate arrival of Julian Vance, and the rhythmic pounding of the wooden stakes had all dissipated. What remained was the quiet, suffocating reality of consequence. My father stood near the bottom step of the porch, holding the 30-day eviction notice. My mother remained beside him, her pristine composure entirely broken. And then there was Vanessa, the golden child, the visionary entrepreneur, the sophisticated urbanite who had returned to claim her rural inheritance, had spent the last hour rapidly descending into panic. As Julian Vance's car disappeared down the county highway, Vanessa finally grasped the full magnitude of her situation. Her multi-million-dollar agritourism project was dead. The luxury cabins, the native grass restoration, the farm-to-table dining experiences she had pitched to her Chicago investors were all vaporized. She had staked her professional reputation and significant capital on a development located entirely on a 10-acre swamp. The transformation was instantaneous. The supportive, loving daughter mask she had worn since arriving vanished completely, revealing the cold, transactional nature that defined her relationship with our parents. She spun around facing my father. Her face was flushed, her eyes narrowed with a toxic, volatile rage. "You told me the boundaries were secure," she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing across the quiet yard. "You stood in that kitchen and told Julian the entire property was under your name. You made me look like an absolute idiot, Richard." My father flinched, the sound of his first name coming from his favorite child, striking him harder than any legal document. "Vanessa, honey," he began, taking a hesitant step toward her. "I did not know. The maps, the original deeds, I thought the footprint was solid. We can fix this. We can renegotiate the terms with the investors." "Renegotiate," Vanessa shrieked, throwing her hands in the air. "Renegotiate what? A bog? A patch of mud that floods every April? You have nothing left. You handed me a worthless swamp, and now I am going to have to spend the next 2 years fighting off lawsuits from my own financial backers." She turned away from him, stomping up the wooden steps of the porch, her expensive leather boots leaving tracks of frosted mud on the floorboards. "I am leaving," she announced over her shoulder. "I am not spending another minute in this disaster." Diane rushed forward, grabbing the railing of the porch. "Vanessa, wait! You cannot just leave us. We have 30 days to vacate the house. We need help packing. We need to figure out where we are going to live. You have that large apartment in Chicago. We could stay with you for a few months until we get back on our feet." Vanessa stopped near the front door, slowly turning her head to look at our mother. The expression on her face was one of absolute, unvarnished revulsion. "Are you joking?" Vanessa sneered. "I live in a high-rise condominium downtown. I am not turning my guest suite into a retirement home for 2 people who just detonated my career. You made this mess, you figure it out." She slammed the front door behind her. My mother let out a small, broken sob, covering her mouth with her hand. My father stood frozen, unable to comprehend that the daughter he had elevated above all else, the daughter he had tried to steal my life for, was abandoning them the second the financial well ran dry. I remained on the safe side of the neon orange line, leaning against my tractor. I watched the golden child discard her parents with the same casual cruelty they had used to discard me. It was a brutal, symmetrical justice playing out in real time. 20 minutes later, the front door swung open again. Vanessa emerged, hauling 2 massive designer suitcases. She struggled down the steps, dragging the heavy bags across the gravel toward her sleek silver SUV. Neither of my parents moved to help her. They stood near the porch, paralyzed by the realization of their total isolation. Vanessa hoisted the luggage into the back of her vehicle, slamming the tailgate shut. She opened the driver's door, pausing for a fraction of a second. She did not look back at the farmhouse. She did not look at our mother, who was quietly weeping on the porch. She certainly did not look at me. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and threw the vehicle into reverse. The tires spun violently, spraying gravel across the yard as she peeled out of the driveway. She accelerated down the county highway, heading back to Chicago, leaving a cloud of dust settling over the silent farm. The moment the money vanished, so did the daughter. Richard and Diane Granger were left entirely alone, standing on the wrong side of the Surveyor string. The patriarch, who had demanded absolute loyalty, was now facing the physical manifestation of his empty ledger. The ensuing weeks were a slow, agonizing descent for my parents. The public tribunal they had orchestrated the previous Sunday had backfired spectacularly. The 15 relatives who had crowded into the living room to demand my submission were now actively avoiding them. Uncle Robert ignored my father's phone calls. Aunt Martha suddenly found herself too busy with church commitments to offer any assistance. The extended family had been willing to enforce the patriarch's rule when they believed he held the power, but the moment his fraud was exposed, they scattered, embarrassed by their own complicity and terrified of being associated with the humiliation. The social isolation extended beyond the bloodline. In a rural Iowa community, news travels faster than a prairie fire. The local agricultural network is tight-knit and fiercely protective of authentic labor. When the town learned that Richard Granger had not only falsified his ownership of the estate, but had actively tried to steal the operation from the daughter who actually ran it, the collective judgment was absolute. When my father drove into town to buy supplies at the local cooperative, the other farmers suddenly found reasons to look the other way. The firm handshakes and hearty congratulations he used to receive were replaced by cold silence and averted gazes. He was a pariah in the very community he had spent decades trying to impress. With no family support, no financial resources, and the 30-day eviction notice ticking down like a bomb, my parents were forced into a humiliating retreat. They could not afford to purchase another farm. They could not even afford a decent house in the surrounding suburbs. The $1,800 remaining in the original joint account barely covered the security deposit on a small, run-down rental apartment on the outskirts of Wapello County. I watched from a distance as they spent their final days on the property packing their belongings into a rented moving truck. They looked small, diminished, entirely stripped of their American Gothic performative pride. They moved slowly, carrying boxes out of the farmhouse that now belonged to my corporate entity. My father avoided looking in my direction. He never approached the pole barn. He never attempted another apology. The silence between us was the only honest conversation we had ever had. On a cold Tuesday morning, exactly 28 days after the surveyor had driven the stakes into the ground, my parents locked the front door of the farmhouse for the last time. They climbed into the cab of the moving truck, the engine sputtering as they pulled out of the gravel driveway. They drove past the neon orange line crossing the boundary of the kingdom they had tried to steal, leaving the estate forever. I stood on the porch holding the keys to the house I had legally reclaimed. The yard was quiet. The heavy machinery was safely locked in my barns. The premium fields stretched out toward the horizon, waiting for the spring thaw. The patriarch had demanded my life as a sacrifice to his ego. He had tried to weaponize the family, the bank, and the law against me, but by trying to steal the legacy from the only daughter who actually tended the soil, he had lost the kingdom, the family, and the very foundation of his identity. The war was over, the boundaries were secured, but the real work, the actual cultivation of the future, was just beginning. The farmhouse was empty, its interior carrying the ghosts of 15 years of silent endurance. I needed to purge those ghosts. I needed to transform the physical space, ensuring the Granger agricultural enterprise reflected the reality of the woman who built it. The low rumble of the diesel engine vibrated through the floorboards of the combine harvester, a steady, powerful rhythm that anchored me to the earth. It was mid-October, exactly 1 year since the neon orange line had severed my past from my future. The Iowa sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, stretching out over fields of golden corn that seemed to roll endlessly toward the horizon. I sat high in the climate-controlled cab, gripping the steering wheel, watching the heavy steel header slice through the dry stalks with effortless precision. The harvest this year was exceptional. The nitrogen management strategies I had implemented out on the eastern ridge were paying off, yielding record-breaking bushels per acre. For 15 years, I had fought this dirt-dragging yields out of exhausted soil while battling the constant headwind of my father's financial incompetence. But this year, the land was finally mine, and the harvest felt like a victory lap. I reached the end of the row, easing the massive machine into a wide, smooth turn. From this elevated vantage point, I had a perfect view of the main yard. The physical transformation of the property was striking. The oppressive, performative energy of the old Granger estate was entirely gone. I had spent the winter renovating the farmhouse, stripping away the rigid American Gothic facade my parents had clung to so desperately. The wraparound porch remained, but the interior had been gutted and repurposed. The formal dining room, where my father had slid the quitclaim deed across the table, was now a sleek, functional conference room, equipped with digital displays for tracking commodity markets. The parlor, where my mother used to arrange her decorative pillows, was a bustling administrative office housing 2 full-time accountants I had hired in the spring. It was no longer a monument to a patriarch's ego. It was the nerve center of a modern, thriving agricultural enterprise, owned and operated exclusively by a woman. I engaged the auto-steer function, letting the GPS guide the combine down the next row, and allowed myself a moment to look past the manicured yard toward the county highway. Just beyond the newly installed security gates, separated by a sturdy wire fence, lay the original 10-acre Granger parcel, the South Bog. It was an unruly, chaotic mess of overgrown cattails, stagnant black water, and rotting driftwood. Without my father there to occasionally mow the dry edges, the swamp had fully reclaimed its territory. It sat there, a permanent, untouched monument to greed and arrogance. My parents had tried to steal a kingdom, and the earth had left them with a mud puddle. They never returned to Wapello County. The social isolation and the crushing weight of their public humiliation had driven them out of the rental apartment after only 3 months. I heard through the local grapevine that they had moved to a small town in southern Missouri to live near one of my father's distant cousins. They were renting a modest duplex, relying entirely on my father's meager Social Security checks. The patriarch, who had demanded absolute loyalty, was now entirely dependent on the charity of relatives he had previously deemed beneath his station. As for Vanessa, she was effectively excommunicated from the family the moment her multi-million-dollar agritourism project collapsed. She had blocked our parents' numbers, changing her social media profiles to private. The investors she had courted so aggressively had indeed threatened legal action, resulting in a quiet, out-of-court settlement that likely drained whatever savings she had acquired. She was still in Chicago, but her days of playing the sophisticated rural visionary were permanently over. My phone buzzed in the cup holder beside me, pulling my attention back inside the cab. I glanced at the screen. It was a text message from a number I had not saved, but instantly recognized. It was my mother. She reached out occasionally, always around the holidays or the anniversary of a significant family event. Her messages were never apologies. They were never acknowledgments of the fraud, the coercion, or the cruelty. They were always thinly veiled attempts at emotional manipulation, designed to test the boundaries I had established. I picked up the phone. The message preview glowed brightly in the shadows of the cab. Thinking of you today, Abby. The autumn leaves remind me of when you were little. Families should be together during the harvest season. We miss you. I read the words twice, analyzing the familiar cadence. A year ago, a message like that would have triggered a cascade of conflicting emotions. I would have felt the old, familiar guilt, the desperate childhood urge to smooth things over, to apologize for my own survival in order to earn a crumb of affection. I would have agonized over a response, drafting and deleting sentences, trying to find a compromise that did not exist. But sitting in the cab of the combine, looking out over the empire I had built and legally secured, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger, there was no pity, there was only the cold, clear recognition of a tactic that no longer worked. She wanted me to believe that family was a biological imperative, an obligation that superseded betrayal. But I knew the truth. They had defined family as a ledger, where I was a permanent debtor and Vanessa was the only authorized beneficiary. I did not owe them my guilt. I did not owe them my forgiveness, and I certainly did not owe them my harvest. I unlocked the phone, navigated to the message thread, and pressed delete. I did not block the number. Blocking felt like a defensive maneuver, an acknowledgement that her words still possessed the power to hurt me. Deleting it was a simple administrative action. The message was irrelevant, and therefore it was discarded. I set the phone back in the cup holder and turned up the volume on the cab radio. A classic rock station was playing, driving a heavy bass line through the speakers. I reached out and adjusted the threshing sequence on the console, ensuring the grain was separating cleanly from the chaff. The combine rolled forward, devouring the stalks, the golden kernels pouring into the holding tank behind me. The noise of the machinery was deafening, powerful, and entirely mine. I looked back out the windshield, the horizon stretching wide and clear. The story of the Granger farm was no longer a cautionary tale of patriarchal control and sibling rivalry. It was a testament to endurance. For 15 years, I had been the invisible backbone of a family that took my labor for granted. I had tolerated their condescension, their demands, and their arrogance because I believed the soil would eventually vindicate me. And it had. But the vindication did not come in the form of a paternal blessing or a tearful apology at a dinner table. It came in the form of official county documents, a neon orange surveyor's line, and a 30-day eviction notice. In the heartland, respect is not inherited by blood. It cannot be commanded by a man sitting at the head of a table who refuses to look at the ledger. It cannot be manufactured by an urban sister who views the dirt as a rustic aesthetic. Respect is earned through the soil. It is earned by the hands that plant the seeds, the mind that calculates the risk, and the quiet, unwavering resolve of a woman who refuses to be erased. I increased the throttle, feeling the surge of power beneath me. The sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating the vast expanse of the premium crop fields. I owned the tractors. I owned the silos. I owned the farmhouse and the ground it was built upon. The Granger legacy was finally secure, and I owned every single grain of it. The air in the cab of the combine harvester is different than the air anywhere else on the farm. It is filtered, temperature-controlled, and strangely isolated even as the machine itself devours the earth with a deafening roar. Up here, 50 feet above the ground, you can see the boundaries of everything you own and everything you have lost. As I watch the neon orange line dissecting my father's former kingdom, separating my thriving fields from his desolate swamp, I realize that the line is not just a geographic marker, it is a scar. It is the physical manifestation of a family dynamic that prized control over character and illusion over reality. The story of the Granger farm is not just a tale of agricultural survival. It is a profound cautionary tale about the fundamental errors we make when we confuse authority with respect and legacy with entitlement. As I reflect on the 15 years it took to build this operation and the 15 days it took to dismantle the toxic structure holding it together, I see a clear, undeniable lesson for American families. We are a culture that loves the aesthetic of the heartland. We romanticize the image of the stoic patriarch, the devoted matriarch, and the children who carry on the family name. We point to paintings like American Gothic and mistake the rigidity of the figures for strength. But what happens when that rigidity is merely a shell hiding a rotting foundation? What happens when a family's primary objective is not the cultivation of its members, but the maintenance of its image? In my family, love was a ledger, and the currency was compliance. My father believed that his title, dad, patriarch, owner, exempted him from the consequences of his incompetence. He believed that his daughters were assets to be managed rather than human beings to be guided. He poured his resources into Vanessa, the golden child, who validated his desire for urban sophistication while treating me, the daughter who actually worked the land, as an infinite, uncomplaining resource. This dynamic is not unique to the Granger farm. It is a quiet plague running through the veins of countless traditional families. We tell parents that their job is to provide, to protect, and to guide, but we rarely teach them the critical importance of emotional honesty. We rarely explain that favoritism is not just a benign preference. It is a weapon that destroys both the favored and the unfavored child. To American parents, the message is stark. You cannot build a legacy on a foundation of unfairness. When you choose to value a child based on how well they reflect your own vanity, rather than acknowledging their true character and contributions, you are planting seeds of division that will inevitably bear a bitter harvest. My father's obsession with control blinded him to the fact that his empire was a mirage, sustained only by the very daughter he was trying to discard. He thought he could command respect at the dinner table, completely ignoring the fact that respect, like the soil, must be earned through tireless stewardship. To young people navigating these treacherous family structures, the lesson is equally clear, though perhaps more painful. You cannot save a family that refuses to save itself. For 15 years, I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I was useful enough, I could eventually earn my parents' love. I thought my sweat would act as a down payment on their respect. It was a lie I told myself to survive the coldness of that house. The truth is, some doors will never open, no matter how hard you knock. and sometimes the most profound act of self-love is simply to stop knocking. Independence is not a betrayal, it is a necessity. You do not owe your life, your labor, or your future to people who only value you when you are convenient. You have the right to draw your own boundary lines, to secure your own foundation, and to walk away from tables where you are no longer being served. From the perspective of a spiritual practitioner observing the current state of our society, the Granger story offers a compelling narrative on the necessity of self-cultivation. We live in an era defined by external validation, where the image we project often supersedes the reality we inhabit. My parents were consumed by Maya, the illusion of the material world. They valued the appearance of wealth and authority over the substance of integrity and connection. True wisdom requires us to strip away the facade and confront the reality of our actions. It demands that we cultivate morality not as a public performance, but as an internal compass. My father's downfall was not caused by a sudden stroke of bad luck. It was the inevitable collapse of a life built on deceit and arrogance. He lacked the resilience that comes from confronting one's own flaws. When faced with the truth of his financial ruin, he did not seek understanding. He sought to control. Self-cultivation is the difficult, often lonely work of pulling the weeds from our own spiritual gardens. It requires us to acknowledge our complicity in our own suffering and the suffering of others. It means choosing fairness over favoritism, honesty over illusion, and vulnerability over rigid control. For parents, this spiritual practice involves recognizing that children are not extensions of the parental ego, but independent souls requiring guidance, not governance. The neon orange line that divides the Granger property is a powerful symbol of boundaries. In our spiritual journeys, we must learn to draw these lines not out of malice, but out of a deep necessity for self-preservation. We must protect our internal landscape from those who seek to exploit or diminish it. And we must accept that sometimes the people we love most are the ones standing on the other side of that line. As I steer the combine down the final row of golden corn, I feel a profound sense of peace. The harvest is not just a collection of grain. It is the culmination of years of endurance, strategy, and ultimate liberation. I have secured my legacy not through inheritance, but through undeniable, irrefutable reality. Welcome to Sophia Vengeance, where we explore the quiet triumphs of those who refuse to be erased. If you have ever had to draw a neon line to protect your own harvest, share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. We are building a community of resilience, one truth at a time. As the sun sets over the Iowa plains, casting long shadows across the fields, I look one last time at the untouched, overgrown swamp that remains of my father's kingdom. It sits there, a silent monument to the things we lose when we try to claim what isn't ours. And I am left with a thought that lingers long after the engine shuts down. We spend so much of our lives trying to prove our worth to people who are determined to misunderstand us. Perhaps the true victory is not in finally being seen by them, but in realizing we never needed their eyes to know our own value. Are you still waiting for permission to claim your own life? Or have you already started drawing the lines